I get my wife chirps me because I always mention the countdown.
Oh, really? Do you ever do that? The final countdown. Du-du-du-du. Do you ever do
That's
that?
right. That's up your lane with the basketball. That's you right there.
That's right. That's right.
So, dude, take me through what do we have behind you? Because speaking of basketball, you have art, basketball, and you're a creative dude. So I know we're going to get into that in general. But
Yeah.
obviously, you got a little flavor behind you to even kick off. Talk to me about what I'm seeing here.
So we got to start off with the GOAT.
Yeah.
And so I'm just gonna lay that down. We don't even have to touch
No,
it,
no.
just so we all know who the GOAT
Yeah,
is in
yeah,
basketball,
yeah.
right? It's Michael Jordan.
No doubt.
No other name need to be mentioned.
Agreed.
And I'm born and raised in Chicago, so I had the good fortune of being raised during the Jordan era.
Wow.
So like, I got to see him live in
Wow.
person when I was a little guy. So I'm 45 years old now. It dates me a little bit. But there was definitely an aura about him, and I've never seen anything live like it before. Just there was a glow, there was a tenacity, and that's part of how I even, fell in love with sports, and I played basketball myself. So I needed to start it off with the man MJ.
Yeah.
I had previously, I had like a picture of kind of like a Muhammad Ali type of figure up there, but then I updated it about 4 or 5 months ago, and I added Kobe because to me, he definitely is like spitting image of MJ, like that work ethic, that hunger,
Yeah.
that drive, talk about Mamba mentality, for those of us that love to dive into mindset and
Yeah.
figuring out how do you soak all the greatness out of you as a human being. I feel like he definitely personified that. And then this is my love for sneakers.
Yeah.
So I have over 150 pairs of sneakers.
Sick. Yeah.
And I was like, you know what? Because I like they're all across my office over here too. So I wanted to have like a visual representation of that
Yeah.
up here.
So what got you into the, I mean, I'll talk about basketball and the mindset. I think that's easy for us to wrap on, but what got you into the sneaker
Yeah.
game?
So some of it is what I was talking about with MJ, because I grew up while these Jordans were coming out for the
Sure.
first time.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. So now, it's like retroing, and you got different models that have come out 4 or 5 times in terms of retros. But for me, it was like I remember the first Jordan I had was the Jordan 4.
Yeah.
And like just standing in line to get it. And at that time my family didn't have much money. So my dad was like, you get one a year,
Yeah. Yeah.
You gotta have one
Stand
and you
in
gotta
line.
preserve it. Yeah, yeah. Right. It's like you get one
Yeah.
for the year. And so we stay in line, and because they were hot
Yeah.
commodities. And I remember the first one that I had was the what they call the bread Jordan 4 right now, but the black and red version. And I was just playing basketball in it, and loving every second of it, and pretty much as many models as I could get after that,
Yeah.
I got. So for me, it's a lot of nostalgia.
Yeah, I love that, man. So you're 45. I would have been, because Michael Jordan was young for me. So you would have been like high school?
Yeah, so I mean, when I remember watching him for the first time, I was in elementary.
Yeah, but okay, yeah, keep going.
Oh,
Yeah, yeah.
yeah, yeah. And then like middle, like fifth grade, around fifth grade is when I really started to get into it, where I was playing a lot more.
Hmm.
Um, and then obviously, he was just larger than
Right.
life. So yeah, by the time I was in high school, the whole world knew about Michael Jordan.
Yeah, I just feel like if I would have been, because he impacted me so much as a young, I was in Detroit. I was the Pistons, and that was kind of like a rivalry for a minute there. And
Yeah.
and then obviously Space Jam came out, and it's like, let's go. And but I feel like that impacted me so much as like a child. I can't imagine what it would have felt like being in high school or and being like aware, like you sort of had like an awareness to it and an understanding to it. So the reason why I'm bringing that up and highlighting it,
Yeah.
is like obviously I knew you were from Chicago, I knew you were a basketball guy, but I've recently had a conversation about Michael Jordan, and I want to get your take on it and wrap on it because
Yeah.
I'm just assuming here, but I would imagine you watched the entire Last Dance.
Without a doubt.
Yes.
Watch the whole thing.
Yes.
Yeah, start to
Yeah.
finish. I mean, during the pandemic,
Yeah.
it was one of those things that I felt like was bringing hope
Yeah.
and so much joy in the midst of the wild nature of what the pandemic was, you know?
Yeah, no doubt. So obviously he's highlighted in that a lot. And I think in those documentaries you get somewhat of a glimpse. It's like this, like we're gonna hear your mind, we're gonna hear you articulate
Mhm.
thoughts and I'm doing the same thing too. But so when you're listening to an athlete on a documentary, you sort of get an idea into how they think. And you have Michael Jordan, who's now years removed from playing the sport, and you kind of hear him talking, right? And you're digesting while he's talking, and you think of his mind. Now, I think like on the surface, and you can give me your perspective of it too. I think on the
Yeah.
surface, when we view Michael Jordan at large scale, it is like the Mamba mentality or the Michael Jordan mentality. It's sort of like the pinnacle of mindset is like the way
Mm.
that I would imagine is like generally assumed. Like I think you can poke holes into
Mhm.
anything, but I think like naturally, if we're taking that into consideration, that's like a fair statement to say. But for you has worked with a lot of people, a lot of athletes, and then even on yourself, and you see someone like that, let me take you to an exact moment where he is talking about, and he's talking about something that happened years prior, obviously, and he starts
Yeah.
crying in this room
Yeah.
because he's saying if you weren't there to win, like essentially, I don't remember the exact words, but he's essentially saying if you weren't about winning, like I didn't want to be around you, these sort of things, and he starts tearing up. Do you
Yeah.
remember this?
Yeah, I remember that moment because go ahead. I wanna let you finish, but I got some thoughts already.
Yeah, yeah. Well, that's the point because I want to get your thoughts on it because I think that it's there's one side of me of that finds it incredibly beautiful and I admire it and I respect it. And then there's one side of me where I maybe pessimistically, that might not even be the right word, but it's like a continual attachment to a former character that he played
Yeah.
long time ago. And so I
Mm.
think it's a balance of two. Now, at the same time, I didn't play at that scale. We didn't play at that scale necessarily. I
Sure.
could feel similar to that too in my own rights in certain parts of my athletic career.
Yeah.
But what are your thoughts just around that in general?
So many. So
Hmm.
I've thought about that moment quite a bit. It did stick out to me in a really big way, obviously, as somebody
Likewise.
who, right, is deeply interested in mindset
Yep.
and what drives people who perform at the highest levels. And what I saw, part of what I saw there was the complexity in terms of human emotion. Some of what I saw was like somebody who was actually wrestling with a little bit of regret
Hmm.
and almost like convincing himself of something,
Yeah.
which is like, this is the way that I had to do it.
Yeah.
There was no other option. And I don't know if he fully believes that. Again, like in that moment, I think that's what was bringing up some of the emotion because, for the work that you and I do, whenever emotion is coming up, we definitely want to explore it.
Hmm.
Right?
Hmm.
And I think for the most part, humans have a very surface level understanding of whatever that emotion is, especially when there's tears connected to it.
100%.
So I saw a guy who definitely achieved at the highest level, but was kind of asking himself, was that the only way?
Hmm.
Could I have accomplished some of these things differently? Part of that is because you could see I mean, this is what to me the documentary exposed in a way that I'd never known before, especially growing up in that era in Chicago.
Sure.
It's like, oh, you could see he wasn't the most liked person by his teammates,
Clearly.
right?
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
um, and though his leadership style was not one that I think created deeper relationships or even like higher levels of connection. At times you could see him sort of ruling through fear or even shame. And I think as a result, there was a lot of collateral damage,
Mm. Well said.
right? So one being like the level of, I would say, disconnection that he had with his teammates off the court.
Hmm.
I also think, it took a toll on his marriage,
Hmm.
which doesn't have to be the case either. You can perform at a high level and have a very intact marriage.
Right.
I think same thing, with his kids, and then you could see his relationship to gambling. So I think he tapped into something that was more fear-based from a mindset standpoint. And it feels like I'd love to hear your thoughts on this too, because it feels like that was more of an old school way of thinking you had to win. It's like I got to tap into rage, anger, fear
Yeah.
in order to create results.
Yeah. Yeah, I love how you categorize that as an old school because I think I didn't know where you were going to go with that, obviously, but I think that really, I think I agree with that. I think I agree with that, but I don't know if I have. I think I can come back to what my more thoughts are on it, but I think right now I'm more curious as to how old school came through to you, as that's how you relayed that.
Yeah, so one, the older generation of athlete tends to communicate this,
Yeah.
which is like you gotta hate the opponent,
Yeah.
and you gotta find a reason to kind of go against them. Even if you watch MJ's Hall of Fame speech, it was again to me fascinating as we connected to this because you could see a guy who always had a vendetta.
Hmm.
Like he was calling people out
At the Hall of,
during
yeah.
his Hall of Fame speech.
Yeah,
You
100%.
know what
Yeah. Yeah.
and I'm just like, man, he can't get out of that way of
Right.
thinking.
Okay. Yeah.
And I like that's what you said. It's like it's almost like he started to fit into a role,
Hmm.
an idea of who he thought he had to be,
Hmm.
and he did get so attached to it that he never relinquished it.
Yeah. Well, I think, okay, that helps me a little bit too on guidance towards that conversation because I think I've been around pro sports for my whole life, largely. My uncle played in the big leagues. My dad was with the Tigers for him as a bullpen catcher. And obviously, like, that brings friends and people that you connect with and you meet. And then I just spent basically parts of 12 years in professional baseball specifically. So you meet this like range of people in an industry, right? Like there are people in professional baseball who are 70 years old, right? And working in it. And so even some people, speaking of my uncle's friends, I know a couple of people who I still hear from today who are still in the game. They're in their 80s. And it's
Yeah.
like, so if you have a 20-year-old and an 80-year-old, there's a 60-year range there of someone working in the same dynamic. And sports is really fascinating because it's identity driven, because it's, in my opinion, it's so large, it's entertainment based. So it's reality TV show for the fan. Like there's an
Yeah.
entertainment transaction there. And what you just said, I'm thinking through some of the things that I've even felt painfully, and I don't want to judge this as a negative or positive. I think it's just things that I've seen of people who are older than me that I've tried to at least try to see that maybe the limitation, even in my own perspective, of people
Yeah.
who have become iconic in a game, iconic as a person. Michael Jordan would be one of them, but I don't know him. I'm talking about people that I know specifically, and you see them even at older ages and they can't go to like a major league stadium. They're still getting addressed by the fans. They're still interacting with younger generations of a game, and you can literally see and feel their connection to the character that they were when they were in their 20s. And even
Mm.
like fans will still uphold them as that person, right? So if a fan meets Michael Jordan, I would largely bet, which is still subjective, but I would bet the house that the fan doesn't meet Michael Jordan as he is right now. They only meet the basketball player Michael Jordan. And I think largely
Mm.
that can become the prison for the iconic person in sport specifically because it happens in a window of your life. And that's what makes sports
Mm.
so unique to me. I don't know if it needs to be categorized as positive or negative, but it's unique to me in the fact that it's like a moment in life for people where they become iconic and then they essentially are mirrored as that thing until
Yeah.
to forever, really.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this is the power of a narrative, right?
Yes.
Right? Like when you
You're great at this, by the
either
way, so unpacked it. Yeah.
well, because like when you can either have a team that can spin a narrative about you, or you could do that yourself, that starts to have momentum.
Mm.
and you almost don't even need to touch it anymore, and you get to decide, do I live into that narrative or not?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's exactly what happened with Michael Jordan. I think the stars aligned for him in terms of like where the league was at, and basketball being pushed to the forefront of sort of like the public conversation. But he definitely chose to dive into the narrative, own it, and embrace this
Yeah.
idea of what it meant to be Michael Jordan. He even talks about himself in third person plenty of times. So
Right.
you
Right.
can kind of see
Well,
that
it's
that
his
mentality
brand,
there.
right? Yeah.
Yeah. And now even people talk about, when you bring up The Last Dance, that he's so preoccupied with still being the greatest player, he could see LeBron kind of catching up. So he released The Last Dance at just the right time to come
Let him
back into
know.
the public consciousness
Yeah.
again. You know what
Yeah.
I mean?
Yeah. Yeah.
Like it's absolutely fascinating to me. And this is where I could see in contrast, right? Where we talk about this old school mindset, which to me is kind of categorized by a fear-based way of approaching winning.
Mm-hmm.
And I look at somebody like Steph Curry because, again, I love the game of basketball, who who actually has accomplished, for the most part, a lot of the same
No
things,
doubt.
but beloved by his teammates, intact marriage, plays with a sense of joy, has no vendettas or things like that, is not trying to prove anything
Mm.
with his game, and plays with this exuberance and this sense of joy.
Mm. Mm-hmm.
Right? Like you could see how light he is
Mm-hmm.
when he's playing the game, which another thing when I look at MJ, you could see he burnt out, retired, obviously went to play baseball for a little bit, came back, burnt out again, retired, came back again.
Mm.
And I think that, again, when you have that fear-based mindset, it is draining.
Mm-hmm.
It actually takes away from your life force. Where you look at Steph Curry, who's not a physical specimen in the classic sense. Like he doesn't necessarily look like a basketball player, but he has been he's changed the game. Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
Right. He's like transformed it. And he's had this amazing upward trajectory because I think he's just coming from a totally different place.
Mm. Do you think that, okay, if we zoom out of sports for a second, do you think that
Yeah.
is Michael Jordan in the baby boomer category? I don't know, I'm sure what his age would be.
Yeah. Maybe.
It's got to be
Let's go
close.
with yeah. Let's go with yeah.
Yeah,
Let's
yeah.
go yeah.
Okay, yeah. We'll zoom out even away from Michael Jordan. Let's just for the context, let's say yes concretely. And
Mhm.
so, do you think that is more just of where the baby boomer mind lives and how they were sort of programmed, and then you look at this next wave of generational shifting, if you will, because I think that largely has to do with what the current landscape of the 25 to 45-year-old is doing right now. And I think that there's just
Yes.
a large scale transition, which is natural. Like that happened in
Yeah.
the baby boomers from the generation above them. Like it's a reoccurring, it's not unique to this part of humanity, but it's part of it. But now you're starting to see these age groups are starting to be the focuses of modern day society. So do you think that is just a byproduct of probably the potential of what the baby boomers were going through, or what that transition, I guess, was like for that age group?
Yeah, I think, and I mean, I'll say this as we dive into this, right? I think you and we've never really talked about this as we've talked about some of these things,
Yeah.
but I like when you use program because I believe our consciousness, just as we zoom out, right? Humanity's consciousness is constantly unfolding.
Mm.
And if we're open to it, like we are getting sort of downloads of new programs
Mm-hmm.
and, right, like our consciousness is deepening if we allow that to happen.
Mm-hmm.
So I think at one point in time, just when we're looking at what does it take to win, what does it take to succeed, what does it take to be great, that baby boomer generation was like, you got to dominate.
Yeah.
You got to in order for you to win, somebody has to lose.
Mm-hmm.
I got to beat you down. I have to be the best and you can't be the best. It feels like it was at times scarcity based,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because there was like this win-lose proposition.
Mm-hmm.
And I think as consciousness has unfolded, I think our world is more so believing, oh, we can all win. Like Because this is what I believe about competition. And again, we haven't really talked about this, but I think at its best, when you are competing at the highest level, you see your competitor as your collaborator.
Mm, mm-hmm.
Because if they're at their best, they're actually inviting the best out in you. So
100%.
you want them to be their best,
Mm-hmm.
and you don't want to kill them.
Mm-mm.
You want them to succeed so that you can keep learning and growing and achieving. Without them being their best, you're not going to be your best. And I think this more collaborative way of looking at competition is the new world that we're in. And the people who step into that play with a lightness and a flow and a sense of play and joy
Yeah.
that's regenerative.
I agree with that. I think that I don't know if this is an accurate comment because I was just writing about this morning. And whenever I'm writing, I'm working on another book right now. And whenever I'm writing a book, the first draft is like what everyone tells you, right? You throw it at the wall. You have no idea where it came from. So I'm packaging this based off of something that earlier today I had no idea where it came from. But I was writing about it. But one of the things that I was writing about, which I don't think is a mystery at this point, is like a lot of what I think the structure of society has been getting shattered, and largely it's been getting shattered since COVID. And I think to what you're saying, I think something that happened in our shift of consciousness and the unfolding of it is we realized our capacity or capabilities of doing things independently, or our ability to go off on our own. And in the ability to go off on our own, there was this large scale abundance. And now in abundance,
Mm.
it's not, it's more like a collective of the consciousness. Like the consciousness is collective. I liken it to the thought of we're the first bridging of the gaps of like traditional life to this new modern life, and it happened very quickly
Mhm.
because we've emerged. Like we grew up, and you were even ahead of me, so you for sure grew
Mhm.
up with no social media in your adolescent teenage years,
Mhm.
but you now have, but you've been young enough to be engaged with that dimension. And so
Right.
you've seen both. You've essentially been this bridge. And I think that that's where our generation is so unique to what you're saying, because we broke through that. Go to school, don't ask questions. Go to college, don't
Yes.
ask questions. If you're not in college and you need a trade, it's one of the two. Like you either start your trade and you go for it forever and you be a plumber until you're 65 and you get the retirement, or you do the job force and you intern and
Yes.
you start low on the hierarchy. And for whatever reason, I just don't think that that's like the modern topic anymore. We're not
No.
doing that. So when you think of the athlete of today's age too, they're just exposed to so many things. And I think I agree with you. I don't know how to correlate it as much to the athletes, ironically, even though I work so much with athletes. I just think it's a fabric of what the life we live in now, as comparison to the before us, which I think is what drove the scarcity. Because if you were to ever leave the hierarchy 40 years ago, like you're getting killed, like you never leave that path. Like it's, you keep your head down and you just follow the structure. And I don't think we live like
Right.
that anymore.
We do not. And I'm glad that so many of us are waking up to it
Mm,
because we're starting to see, hold on a second, there's plenty of paths to take,
mm. Plenty.
right? Like there's so many possibilities. And that, I mean, sometimes I like to describe myself that way as a coach, right? It's like I want to be a walking possibility for the people that I
Oh,
serve.
wow. That's awesome.
So that, right? So that when they're around me, they start to see possibilities that they never saw before
Hmm.
in terms of what they can create, who they can be, all that stuff, right?
Yeah.
It's like, oh, I'm not limited. I'm no longer limited in the ways that I thought I was.
Hmm.
And I think that's a part of the old framework is like, if you want to succeed, here's the path.
Yeah.
If you want to win, this is the way to do it. And there was so much conviction around it,
Yeah. How could you not buy into it?
right? I mean, we could get into political conversations about it too, but without going into that, it's like, I think we're inviting people into, hey, let's open up to a brand new way of showing up. And in this way, we truly can all win.
Mm.
And there's enough room at the table. There's
Yeah.
enough food for everyone. So
Yeah.
let's sit down and eat.
Yeah, enjoy. So, okay, then let me, because obviously I know a bit about you. But for the people who are listening, you're a guy, a Midwest kid, grows up in Chicago, basketball guy, takes a curiosity into sneakers, and now
Yeah.
you're in San Diego, and
Yeah.
you're on the West Coast, and you're on like the peak of the country largely. You're in a very unique spot in the world, even. But I mean, I've traveled the country often, and it's clear the stereotypicals. Like it's clearly you can tell when you're in the South, you can tell when you're in the Midwest, you can tell when you're out west, and none of that is all that is neutral as well. But my point is your capacity to move and find limitlessness and job sources or family and all these things. What has it been like just growing up in the Midwest and being exposed to Midwest morals and principles and the way people are up there and the cold and the temperature and the climate of basketball in that part of the world really, and then
Yeah.
now you're in San Diego and that has its own new meaning. What, like, just in terms of you picked up on how your consciousness has evolved, just on the sheer fact that we now can do that, like we also can live anywhere we want and travel
Yeah.
anywhere we want.
Well, I'll frame it this way if I'm picking up what you're throwing down. One, when I was growing up in the neighborhood that I was growing up in, which is Humboldt Park, Chicago, so it's where all the Puerto Ricans lived in Chicago.
Mm.
I'm Puerto Rican and Persian. One of the things that I only realized in retrospect was not many of us dreamt beyond the boundaries of our neighborhood, right? So like it was almost a badge of honor to be like, I'm from the hood
Yep.
and I'm like staying in the hood and I'm about the hood.
Yeah.
And so that was one mindset that I'm like, I was carrying too
Sure.
as a young kid, right? Like I'm proud to be from Humboldt Park. And then there's, man, I love Chicago. So if you hang around Chicagoans at all, we are so proud of
Oh,
Chicago.
Chicago is one of the coolest cities in the world. I love Chicago. Been there many times.
Right?
Yeah.
It's like great
It's a
city,
great
great
city.
food, obviously, great sports scene. There's just so much to love about the city, the architecture, I mean, the people, right? The vibes. So I was always a person who was like, I'm never leaving.
Mm.
This is my city. And I remember one of my friends, he was thinking about leaving, as we got older. And I told him, I'm like, why would you even think about that?
Yeah.
Like we don't do that.
Yeah.
We don't do that
Yeah.
here.
We stay here.
We stay in our city.
Place your flag and stay
And
here.
right,
Yeah.
it's just like
This is home.
it's
Right.
as we talk about identity, right? It was like we would really allow our identity to be enmeshed with our city.
Mm.
And as time progressed, I could sense something new brewing in me.
Yeah.
And it was this thing of like, oh, if you want to like actualize, if you want to grow at a higher level, you're gonna need to leave this place.
Mm.
Very uncomfortable for me. So even if we talk about hero's journey stuff, right, it was really like get out of the comfort zone, go on your journey,
Mm.
discover truly who you are. If you're saying you want to be the best version of yourself, the more I heard that, which is like, it's actually not going to happen here. It's not going to happen in this place where you know everybody, everybody knows you, right? Like you got to shift.
Mhm.
So that was very difficult for me. Part of it too, being Latino, you don't leave home. You don't go too far from your parents
Mhm.
as somebody who's Puerto Rican, right?
Mhm.
And I remember I thought my mom had a hard time with that. My parents had a hard time with that. They were like, "What? Like, why would you want to leave? And are you coming back?" All that stuff basically went down. And I remember I said, "This is actually what triggered it." I went to go see this film. I don't know if you're familiar with it. It's a film called Burn After Reading.
I'm not sure.
So it's a Coen Brothers movie.
Okay.
And if you watch Coen Brother movies, they specialize in having a protagonist in their stories who goes through the whole journey but doesn't change.
Okay.
And I was like, you know, I watched this film, and that's essentially what their protagonist did, right? The main character in the story goes through the whole story, and then they end up where they were in the beginning.
Mm.
And so as I left, I went to this movie with a whole bunch of friends, and I'm a big time extrovert. So after the movie, I just told them, I was like, I need to walk home by myself. And they were all like, what?
Yeah.
Are you
Shocking.
okay?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, they're like,
Yeah.
are you okay? What's going on?
Yeah.
And I said, man, I just feel like I got to do some soul searching and I need some answers. I got to wrestle with God a little
Yeah.
bit. And I walked home by myself and I had this very spiritual moment where I could sense it was time to close this chapter in my
Wow.
life of calling Chicago home base. Like Chicago will always be home, but what I could sense was like, oh, it's no longer going to be home base. And there was this invitation to go on a grand adventure,
Mm-hmm.
to explore a new part of who I was and to essentially, I think, become a man in a brand new way.
Mm-hmm.
I think this was part of my rite of passage, is to get away from what was known and comfortable and to finally be out of it and say, okay, fend for yourself,
Mm-hmm.
figure out your life.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what I did when I moved to LA, and I jumped into a leadership program there. And all the while, I'm a professional speaker,
Yeah.
so I'm still traveling and speaking and doing my thing as a speaker. While I was in LA, I finished this leadership program and started to set up some roots there. But it wasn't easy for me. And also I say it often, it's one of the greatest decisions that I ever made with my
I
life.
bet. Yeah. Well, it has to be. Yeah. But yeah. How so?
Well, like I said, and I didn't have the story framework that I just kind of broke down,
Mm-hmm.
right? I didn't know back then that you can't really become the next version of yourself without getting out of your comfort zone.
Right.
And I was so, I think, kind of committed to my comfort zone of Chicago, and for good reason, right? Like there were so many justifications why I wouldn't want to leave.
Mm-hmm.
But choosing to leave, it invited me into a different level of growth when it comes to business. Like I started to tap into new networks,
Mm-hmm.
new platforms as a speaker. But then I also, when I came to Los Angeles, I was like, oh man, there's so many dreamers here. There's so many creatives here.
Mm-hmm.
And it started to rub off on me in a different way where I didn't realize I was an artist until I came to LA.
Mm. That
I was
lands.
always, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, so again, this is part of my generation where you kind of had to choose.
Mm-hmm.
And especially for a young man in my generation, it was like, you got to be an athlete.
Mm-hmm.
So I defined myself primarily as an athlete, and I was missing out on my artistic side.
Mm-hmm.
Like I never really tapped into that. So, going across the nation, I started to like tap into this artistic side of me and realize, oh man, yeah, there's an athletic side, but there's also artist in me.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm a storyteller.
Mm-hmm.
I'm a creative.
Yeah.
And that's a big part of who I am that it didn't click until I landed in LA and I started to rub shoulders with people who were living this life and pursuing their dreams of storytelling themselves and being creative and taking risks in this brand new way. So that was one of the major ways that my life drastically changed, because it wasn't until I was literally, in my 30s that this clicked for me.
That really hits me in home, because that's what I felt like when I went to San Francisco. And I've always felt like a storyteller myself, but philosophy took off for me in San Francisco. And it was odd because before I went to San Francisco, are you into Alan Watts at all?
Love
Philosopher.
them.
Yeah,
Yeah.
love Alan Watts. And I was into Alan Watts a little bit, but then I go to San Francisco. So I had a history with Alan Watts. And then I go to San Francisco and I find out that he lived in Sausalito and he lived on a houseboat, and it was
Mm.
whatever, 20 minutes north of where I was living. And ironically, before I knew that, Sausalito had become quickly my favorite place to go when I was in San
Mm.
Francisco. So I was really connected with this space in San Fran. And then I find out, now I'm still listening to Alan Watts's work. I'm still into his work. I just don't know this tidbit of information just yet, right?
Yeah.
And so then about a year into it or so, a guy on our team who's one of my very close friends now, he came in, passed in and out through San Fran, and he lived on a houseboat. And one of the reasons why he lived there was because loved Alan Watts. So he tells me this. And I'm like, no way. That's my favorite place. Like, incredible. I know where all those houseboats are. And then I went on like a rabbit hole search, deep dive of philosophers, and I found about some of the Zen monasteries out there in Northern California. And then I started actually I went to the temple and met with one of the monks and would talk about Zen and philosophy and practices. And I really deep dived into this like community because that was the hippie revelation, I guess, or I guess it could be both,
Yeah.
that occurred in that area. And I deep dove into what that was and the how it kind of took two sides. Like materially, it got political and got demonized as like drugs and alcohol and sex
Mm.
and drugs and all those things. But like in reality, like the movement was not that. It was love and capacity and abundance and sharing and all these things. And so I kind of got to study that like there.
Mm.
And it
Yeah.
started poking me over the last 4 years. It started poking me to all these people in the area who were Eli was the guy who had been a monk for many years, and he was kind of my mentor in that space. And then B, I kind of floated into some of these philosophers who were living in these mountains in these beautiful places on the cliffs in northern San Francisco. And it's weird. It literally pulled out of me my love of philosophy.
Mm.
And I didn't know. I always felt connected to that, but I didn't know I had
Yeah.
that in me. And that pulled that out of me. And to go more on what you're saying, I mean, I've lived all over the country for the last 20 years. And I think years ago when I used to go back home, hero's journey style, I would go back to Detroit and people, now I love these people. They're my friends and family, but
Yeah.
they would almost like chirp me to a degree because I'd come back after a year or two and I'd be different. I would wear different clothes. I
Yeah.
would think of different things. And it took me a while in my early 20s, around mid 20s, I started to come aware to this stuff and I was able to evolve from it. But it was like I lived in Arizona years ago and I became a cowboy and I would wear cowboy boots and I would have that style. When I lived in
Yeah.
Minnesota, I became a hipster, and that was the coffee community of lake going hipsters that live around Minneapolis. But then I had the northern Minnesota, which was the lumberjack sauna Finnish Scandinavian culture. Then I just mentioned the San Francisco philosopher culture. And yeah, I've been a Florida beach goer, where you got the palm shoes and the no shoes, and you're hanging out at
Yeah.
the tiki bars. But I think we're all of those. It kind of goes back to what we were saying earlier about consciousness. I do think that we are all things, and I think sometimes, to
Yeah.
your point, if we get stuck where we grew up or where we started, we only think we're that thing. And to your
Yeah.
route, you've kind of moved up and came back this way, and now you're in San Diego. I think that as you just said that, I think that's what really resonated with me. I've experienced that exact feeling.
Yeah. And I think that's the invitation for all of us, right? Is like figuring out where have we attached our identity in a way that's very limiting? Are we willing to step away from that, even if it's just for a season?
Well, okay, so let's peel into that. So because that's really, and I'm sure you help people with this because it's still intimidating because it still is an unknown, and you
Yeah,
you
absolutely.
still have to shed some things. So what do you take from that in a point of kind of being able to guide or walk somebody through in a narrative change or the shedding of the old self and just kind of stepping into something new and reframing stories, if you will? However you want to take that question, form it to how you hear it.
Well, so this is what comes to mind to kind of make sense of it. I was in a session with one of my guys who's a uh, MLB player,
Mm-hmm.
and I remember there was this tension that I could sense in him, like there was this fear around making money. And he said more than once in the call that I had with him, he was like, because while I'm playing, this is the most money that I'm gonna make in my life. Like I'm gonna make all my money during my baseball career. And I heard him say it a few times. I was like, who told you that? Like, how do you know you're not gonna make more money after baseball? Why do you think you're limited to this little brief window of time in terms of your money making ability?
Mm-hmm.
And you could see it just kind of stopped him in his tracks. And he's like, yeah, what if?
Yeah.
Right. So and the more we started to talk about it as like, hey, what if after you're done, you make X, Y, and Z? What would that look like? And he's like, yo, for the first time, I don't feel this tension that I felt my whole playing career. Like I have to do this now.
Mhm,
And it's to me, it's another version of what we're talking about, right? Is like I was inviting him outside of this perspective that this is where it all lives.
mhm,
And what if it's somewhere else? And again, I think we can invite people out of the comfort zone in ways that also inspire them. I think sometimes we think about invitations outside of the comfort zone that are only have to be painful and like, okay, well, I guess I have to do this now. But sometimes when you even see your comfort zone could be a place of pain too, right? Especially when you think it's a prison and you have to do all these kinds of things while you're here.
mhm.
So, hopefully that kind of speaks to what we're talking about because I like I said, the possibility portion of it. If I see a limiting belief, that's the entry point to something that's brand new. And my ears are really in tune with it, whether that be, me, Chicago's my home forever, my athlete who says I'm only going to make money while I'm playing, or the CEO that says I can never walk away from the business, whatever it is, right? We unnecessarily attach ourselves to these places, to these things, to these identities that don't have to be our end all be all. And yes, for a portion of time, it's a little bit scary, but then it becomes really exhilarating when you realize you're not whatever you thought that thing was.
Yeah.
And you're much more than that,
Mhm,
And then once you start to set off on that adventure and you start to see and you start to get some of that buzz of like, oh, wow, now you realize how expansive you truly are. And that's part of what I love to see. But first, it starts with, I think, as you know, right? It's just inquiry. Let's ask some questions.
mhm, mhm.
Are we willing to consider this question? Are we willing to consider we're wrong about X, Y, and Z? If we are, now we can set a new path.
Do you ever think that we could, how do I want to put this? It's like clearly we all have a limitation right now, right? We have well, I'll put it in the frame of the Tao. I just read the Tao Te Chang. Where was I? Somewhere over here. I just read that the other day. It's simple read. It's not simple read. It's a tough read, but it's 81 verses,
Yeah.
right? And
Yeah.
one of the things before you read the Tao, the breakdown of the Tao is essentially love is in 5 stages, and it's similar to consciousness. But the final stage of the Tao is becoming love. And I loved this part in it because the writing is basically trying to express that while you're alive, you can't actually get to the final stage of the Tao. You can't fully
Mhm.
become love, and it's being framed in this book based on the fact that of the last like 10,000 years, like since the agrarian culture, the agriculturist phase, and we all kind of came in and we had necessities of survival and these sort of things. So if we were limitless, we weren't living in these um, stationary spots. We were the Tao because you had no other choice. Like you were fully engaged with nature. You were coexisting.
Mhm.
And so now if you fast forward 10, 15,000 years to right now, the mass industrialization of the world, which is what we are, right? It's
Mhm.
like, yes, we're extremely limitless, but then in terms of the enlightenment, you could almost find yourself in an enlightenment trap and feel like
Mhm.
there is no limitation. So I guess I don't know if there's necessarily a
Yeah.
question. It's just more of a throw back to you, hand you over the mic
Yeah.
metaphorically to just rip on how do you navigate that, even maybe yourself or with people of yes, you are limitless, but you yourself in perspective potentially have limitation at all times as well. There's a balance.
Yeah. What emerges for me is I really believe if you're going to step into your power, you need to embrace paradox.
Mm. Which is the Tao,
Like,
which is
yeah. So,
perfect.
right.
Yeah, it's
So,
entire. Those are all
and
the verses. Yeah.
right. Like, this is part of what I think, again, it's very uncomfortable for us as humans because we want one thing to be the answer, right? Because that does deliver sort of the illusion of safety
Mhm.
instead of understanding, oh, what if I am both limited and limitless at the same time? And the more I embrace the two sides, the more I can live in my fullness, right? It's even like, what does it look like for me to be patient and impatient at the same time? And I think the more we just try to have one gear, the more we hold ourselves back. And I think culturally, this is part of what we've even been talking is usually a pendulum swings in terms of consciousness, and then we just gravitate towards that one area. And we're like, oh, it's about this. And I'm going to worship the altar of like whatever this one particular way of showing up is.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Instead of understanding, usually, right, then it swings the other way. And then we find a new way, sort of like a middle ground of the two things.
Yeah.
So that's for me what really emerges. And that's what I love, again, is helping the people that I work with in this area to spot the both and so that they can notice what the moment is asking of them. What I really believe it takes to be a high performer is if you can discern what the moment is asking of you and then show up that way. That's what it takes to like overcome whatever hurdle in front of you. I think we are so limited because one, we can't tell what the moment's asking us for. One, two, we try to tackle the moment with whatever our natural self can do. Right? Which is again the nature of limitation, instead of saying being transformative will help you accomplish what's in front of you. Can you shift to become who you need to be in the moment to accomplish or cross the finish line? Right? Because in any sport, as we talk about sports, in any industry, you need that beautiful flexibility and pliability from moment to moment.
Absolutely.
And the more you think it's just a template, the more pain and suffering, I would say unnecessary pain and suffering you're going to step into.
Sure.
Because sure, pain and suffering is a part of the human equation, but you don't have to participate when you can actually learn how to be more nimble than maybe you ever have been before. So that's really what emerges for me when you frame it the way that you just did.
Yeah. Why do it's sort of the contract to exist in Paradox. What do you think? This is just a broad question,
Okay.
philosophically, I suppose, too, after I
Yeah.
gave you that San Francisco rant. But what do you think? What do you think the meaning of Paradox is?
Yeah. So we're going to get, there probably not too many people are going to be able to access this with us, but let's just go anyway,
Yeah, let's do it.
right?
Let's do it.
So I think the meaning of paradox is to embrace the divine in everyday life. So I think the divine isn't so easily understood. And again, I think part of as humans, we want things to be in neat boxes. What it means to know your spirituality and to come into contact with the divine is to know that it's not predictable, right? It's not a simple equation. Doesn't belong in any particular box. The moment you think you've captured it, it's gone, right? So I think it's this thing that keeps us alive and aware to something that's beyond us, right? Because we don't like contradiction. We don't want contradiction. We want predictability, safety, comfort. And I think that's what God is inviting all of us into is like, are you willing to live by faith where you thought you knew something, but also this is true?
Yeah.
So to me, I love that question.
Yeah.
Because that's what it brings up for me. And again, I think that makes a lot of people uncomfortable, right? Most humans don't want to step into the conversation for like the divine and what's beyond us.
Right.
It's not just physical. It's not just predictable. There's way more to the story if we're willing to go there. But I want to put that back on you because I'd love to hear your take on that.
Yeah. So first of all, beautiful answer. That was beautiful. I was very locked into what you were saying because I felt like I was very connected to what you were saying right there. And I think that I will answer that in my perspective, but I think that even the contradictory of that truth has been hard to handle in my own personal life, because it's, even if I can grasp that as true, I do what you just said. I want to grab it and go, well, that's true. And then the second that I want to actualize what I think that is true, I attach a material ego to it as if I know. And I think that becomes the same thing, back to what you were saying. It's in my second chapter of my latest book. I titled it Abstract God, because I'm
Mm.
basically going towards the observation of what is the likelihood of us ever talking about the same God. And we just need the word divine or universe or source or God to let us play in the sandbox together. It allows us to know, okay,
Mm.
this is what we're talking about. Anyways, my shot at that is similar. It's hard for me to not bring up my last book in this,
Yeah, go for it.
because my last book is titled Without Words, and largely it was kind of, you said this earlier, but largely is when I got into breathing about 10 years ago. I caught fire with it. It changed my life. I had some transformational spirit, like how you went on that walk. I went
Hmm.
into, you just were in Minnesota and you jumped in the water. I had a moment where I jumped in the water 10 years ago and it changed my life. Like, truly, it was a moment I connected with God. And
Mm.
I didn't know how to communicate that publicly. So, but I knew I felt something. I say this often to people. I think when something impacts your life so aggressively, it's your natural instinct to feel like you need to share that and have everybody else experience it as well.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so I did that, and I ran that as hard as I possibly could for X amount of years. And we actually talked about this in Scottsdale last year. I mentioned this briefly in Scottsdale. I was saying I became so good at articulating
Mm.
information and educating people with answers driven through science and research and literature, because I didn't come from an educational background. So I was in these jobs that
Mm.
required educational backgrounds, and I didn't have the educational background. So in order to mask that insecurity of being myself fully, I just became obsessed with regurgitating, articulating information, and being able to try to create a skill that made me perceivably better or smarter than you. And
Mm.
that was what was maintaining my career largely, if that makes
Wow.
sense.
Yeah. Yes.
And what really came back to me was, years later, this is like a whole transition. But then when I went through that whole pursuit and I got all the way to the top of that mountain, only to realize that I had no idea what I was talking about. And all of the
Mm.
psychology and physiological work that I had perceivably mastered in terms of articulating material, I've come to grips with the understanding that anything that we do is what you just said. It's divine. And so anything in psychology brings you back to the divine at the end. There's a ceiling to anything material
Right.
that we get to. And
Right.
so that was so frustrating to me. And part of that, the beginning of that frustration, you were kind of in the beginning stages of when I was writing that book, because I
Mm.
was starting to publicly express the frustration that I had with teaching in my own
Mm.
pursuit, because I realized that the absolute the life is a paradox, similar to what you said. And in the midst of paradox, it's used by God to essentially justify ourselves to no one but God. Because if I try to prove to you who I am, I lose myself. And
Yes.
that's what I've really, so I titled the book Without Words, because it was my way of expressing that I can't tell you who you are and you can't tell me who you are, and I can't tell you what is right and you can't tell me what is right, but we are here collectively walking the path together. And even if me trying to speak that into existence, I still can't get it to its purest form. And
Mm.
that's where that was it was hard for me in teaching, because it was
Yeah.
really making me face myself in a lot of the ways in which I had formed my character as a coach, really.
And I mean, it seems like that's the invitation for all of us, right? It's like come to grips with who you are, and you're more than one thing,
Hmm.
right? Like you're not just good, you're not just bad.
Yeah.
You're not just this, you're not just that. You're more than one thing happening at the same time.
Yeah.
That's part of why I even love I have a 3-year-old and a 1-year-old, and by the way, like welcome to the world of
Yeah.
fatherhood, right?
Yeah.
Where you're stepping into it, and it's like when I first I'll say this, um, but also I was going to say something else, but this just emerged for me. When my daughter was born, because she's my 3-year-old, and then we have a 1-year-old named Koa, I was overcome with like so many emotions at the same time. It was a new experience for me that I can't even put into words because it wasn't just one feeling
Right.
that happened.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And it was like this flooding of maybe like 7 emotions.
Mhm.
And it became something like miraculous and otherworldly and transcendent. And I was like, oh my gosh, whatever, this needs a term.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like, what's the framing for whatever this is? Because I've never felt this before, but yet it's like, it's supernatural.
Mhm.
Um, so that was one thing. And then I was going to say, when I was talking about I have a 3-year-old, when we saw Inside Out for the first time, which is a
Great
Pixar
movie. Yeah,
movie,
it's a great movie.
and what they create there, right? Which is like in the first one, hey, sadness and joy, what if they belong together? Another seemingly paradox, right? Is like, what if it's not like, well, you feel joy and then you feel sadness?
Mhm.
What if you sometimes feel them at the same time?
Right.
And you're in the moment where they actually are great bedfellows if you allow them to sit with you
Mhm.
and step into that next level of human experience,
Mm.
right? That's what I feel like has been constantly unfolding in me, and it sounds like, it's unfolding in you too. And I think that's how we help people be their best.
Mm.
Part of it is embracing the complexity of the human experience.
Yeah.
It's not just cut and dry. You're not just a body. You're not just emotions,
Mhm.
right? You're not just thinking. You're not just feeling. You also have spirit, right? You have all these things working together at the same time. And I think you're at your best when you're in alignment with all of it,
Agreed.
right? So, what does it take to actually get into that place consistently?
Well, let me say, because I got away from the main point of this part, but I want to throw this back at
Yeah.
you, what you
Yeah.
just said. When what have come to understand in writing that last book is that we have two sides to this. We have, as you use, the human experience. So the human experience is in my understanding is physical, mind, and body. And the spirit comes into the human experience from birth to death. So the soul
Mm.
has this human experience from the day we're born to the day we die. And the ceiling is factual, and we can get closer to understanding the narrative of the mind body vehicle. Like we can tell what psychological traps happen naturally, how behaviors come up, what emotions are.
Mm.
We can talk about anatomy and an inhale exhale. Like we can talk about blood flow, etc. And we can understand the nervous system, and that's fine. That's material. But you are a spirit that is unraveling itself the more that you step into what you're saying, the power of your material self. So it's not a either or like this one's necessarily better than this one or whatnot. It's just more of the fact that like you have a material self that you play with in this experience, in this reality. And the more that you play, you expose yourself to your actual state of becoming, which is your soul. And that I think is without words. The Harvey Martin character that I'm telling you about, I can tell you who I am, where I'm from. You can say you're from Chicago. I have Puerto Rican heritage in me. This is my family tree. This is my birthday. This is my kids, 1 and 3. And this is what you can do all that. And I think that that's
Yeah.
fine. I think the disconnect, and I want to see what you think about this. I think
Yeah.
the large disconnect happens when we materially suffer in pain and suffering versus spiritual suffering. And I feel like that is where we
Mm.
divert into our decisions or our paths, is that if we're consumed with material as real, as actuality, then we disconnect from the intuition and the limitless and kind of what you're talking about, to be able to reframe,
Mm.
to take off your former mask and move to LA and tell stories and say, oh, I am an artist, and it peels
Yeah.
fatherhood similarly. But
Yeah.
that's what I've been chewing on for the last probably couple of years. But that was what a lot of my writing has been coming out as, is trying to understand those two and being able to be comfortable with them. Because even that, and let me know what you think about this, even that could be a paradox, right?
When you say that, can you,
Spirit
when
and
you say that, what do
spirit
you mean?
and material, like it could
Yes.
be, that
Yeah,
could be paradoxal.
for sure. I think it is. And I mean, so, we haven't talked about specificity in terms of my spiritual framework. So for me,
Yeah, go for
I I've chosen to kind of stake my claim as like, okay, I'm going to follow this person called
it.
Jesus.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And part of that is because he's an example of what we're talking about, right? At least the claim that he communicated was, I am God, but I'm also man, right? Like I'm material, but I'm also spiritual. And there's something really powerful and transcendent about him showing up and saying, okay, now I'm also the king of the universe, but I'm also a servant,
Yeah, yeah.
right? Like
I
I'm
love where you're going
the
with this.
highest of the highest of the high,
Yeah.
but then I'm gonna show up as the lowest of the lowest of the low, and then I'm gonna give my life for the sake of human beings, so that I think it's part of what we're talking about, right? You can start to suffer with purpose,
Mm.
because that's what I'm doing, and I want to show the world I'm not here to suffer for no reason.
Right.
I'm here to suffer for purpose. I'm here to suffer for a bigger story. And I think that's the true path of spirituality. It's like when you start to understand that you can suffer for something greater, and you can suffer for freedom, you can suffer for joy,
Mm.
you can suffer for forgiveness,
Mm.
right? You can suffer for faith, not just suffer and go on this endless cycle of suffering,
Mhm.
hoping that, oh, if I suffer enough, then I'll be good enough for whatever it is. It's not about that. I think it's about confronting suffering instead of running away from it, because suffering has something to teach you,
Isn't that wild?
right? Like,
Yeah.
and I think this is when we working with our guys, right? Like our athletes who, guys or girls, when they can start to see whatever challenge is in front of them, there's good news in it, right? Don't run away from it. Don't think it's there to destroy you. It's there to build you up. And if you have the eyes to see it, right? If you have the eyes to see, oh, there's a reason why I haven't, hit for 5, 6, 10 games, whatever it is. It's because I'm being invited into a higher level of intentionality or curiosity or depth to understand my craft.
Mm.
And I can't do that without this level of hurt right now.
Mhm.
Because now it's inviting me to slow down, ask some different questions,
Mhm.
come to grips with some of my limitations,
Mhm.
ask for feedback, partner with somebody in a deeper way, right?
Mhm.
Those are really grand invitations that most of us don't step into, because we like to suffer alone and think life is out to get me.
Mhm.
So, yeah.
That is so, I love that, man. That is so beautiful. There was a buddy of mine, is a former college teammate. He's a priest now. And he, we've been talking on Saturdays, and he just talked about, I'm going to butcher his quote, but he talked about loneliness is not being alone. It's feeling like you're not being seen. And he was talking about the material side. Like, we feel if a guy doesn't get a hit for 10 games and feels invaluable or insecure, it's a loneliness feeling for humanity, because and you're talking about the highest level. First of all, that's one of the things I
Right.
think about sports, which is really intriguing, is that, if you have a couple bad days at work and other positions, and no disrespect to them, but you also don't have millions of people dogging you. I have a good friend of mine who the camp just started today, and he unfortunately he's not healthy right now. He will be, but he's not performing health wise. And I went on for a second today and just watched tons of people just bashing him for not being healthy in camp. And, those are materially, that's part of the entertainment value. So that's
Yeah.
part of the bit. That's part of what the character is. Like, to the people who have access to filter comments, they're just making fun of a character. They're not, they
Yep.
don't understand the soul aspect of that for that person. Anyways, back to what you were saying. And my thoughts of this with my buddy who's a priest, he was talking about how when we are living materially in our ego and our mind body and treating that as actuality, we're disconnected from spirit. We have no choice but to feel lonely, because we don't feel seen. So then you can have people who lash out and say, well, this is wrong, this is poor me, society doesn't get it, it's against me. And he was saying that's just another way of trying to justify to humans. And the truth in what you're saying, when you face suffering like that, the truth of loneliness, the mirror back to you, is loneliness is actually a power, because in loneliness and in silence, you don't have to justify anything to God, because God understands you and hears you. And that's an entirely different state of loneliness. And I think, to what you're saying, I agree with you. I think sports is transcending spiritually at the end of the day, because it
Yeah.
does that for you. It has you go through these crazy moments of stress and chaos at a public scene, where it's materialism on a billion, consumerism, entertainment value, all these things. And the fortunate side of it is that some of these guys get to have, and girls get to have, the path to transcend at that level. And and I'm sure you've experienced many, many experiences with people you've worked with. That is a beautiful thing to be. You admire it. It's inspiring, because people
Absolutely.
can learn themselves at that stage.
And I think that to me, that's exactly what sports is that I think we miss out on. It's this framework that was invented by us as
Yeah.
humans. What it allows us to do is and meet ourselves at a really high level,
Hmm.
because you're putting yourself on the line day in and day out to be seen, to be critiqued, to be ridiculed, right?
Hmm.
To for people to demand a performance of you,
Hmm.
to demand something from you day in and day out, right? I always like to say that sports is like one of the only realms of life where you shit the bed today and you can't hide tomorrow. You got to show up again tomorrow.
Yeah.
Where just like you're saying, God bless, there's so many different ways of making a living, but if you shit the bed in the office, you can hide for a while.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like you can hide in your cubicle. You could call in sick. You can't really do that in professional sports. And I think as a result, if you have eyes to see it, and if you're willing to do what we do with folks, which is invite somebody in who's going to walk alongside you as a guide, and not only help you make sense of things,
Hmm.
but help you find your power in the most difficult of times,
Mm. Well said.
right? Because that's what I love. I always say, anybody who tells you do what I'm telling you to do and you're going to go get results, they're charlatans.
Hmm.
They're That's not real. What I like to say is, hey, let me walk alongside you, and I guarantee you, no matter what you're going through, you'll be able to walk through it with power.
Mm.
It
Love
won't
that.
deflate you, right? It won't deflate you. You'll be able to show up again knowing who you are,
Mm.
secure, moving through it, even at times, maybe even looking forward to what the world calls failure, because you know it can't beat you.
Mhm.
It's actually there to make you better. So that's part of the big shift, right? Is like stepping into this new narrative where everything is a gift and everything belongs.
That is so beautiful, man. I love how, if you kind of think about it, that's like full circle all the way back to where we started, about how, and
Hmm.
that's kind of the Steph Curry example you were bringing, essentially. And
Absolutely.
yeah, we kind of unpacked and wrapped. That's beautiful. I know, I want to pay respects to your time here, so we'll kind of unwind here and wrap up. But um, wow, that's beautiful. I really appreciate you jumping on and chatting with me today, man. That was a
I feel like we were only talking for 15 minutes. It felt like it went by so fast, right?
Yeah, that was a lot of fun. It's been great. I mean, I don't even remember, did we just meet in Scottsdale? Was that the first time we met?
Well, because
Or did
we've
we meet in
we've
San
had
Diego?
mutual
Yeah,
friends. No, it was Scottsdale first,
and then San
and
Diego.
then we were like, hey, let's hang out because you were like,
Yeah,
we'll be
yeah,
in
yeah.
San Diego, and then we had coffee in San Diego. But I know for a while people were like, hey, you guys need to connect,
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I was
and
getting
so we
that
were
for a
like
minute.
missing each other maybe for like a year,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
And then finally it happened.
No, it's beautiful, man. I really like the direction we just went into, and it's inspiring. It's inspiring. I still think back to, like I said, the first time I met you in Scottsdale. I just loved your energy around that circle. I've told you that numerous times, but there was also there was a moment where you talked about we were doing certain things in Scottsdale and we were doing breath work, and I remember you were asking me like, am I supposed to, should I be doing that now? You know, I don't know if you remember that, but you were like thinking
Yeah.
about that and your curiosity side. But I think even that in and of itself, that was something that gravitated me to you right away, was just
Mm,
your ability to hold space for, I mean, you're very articulated and intellectually sound and understanding of your craft, and you have tons of reps, so it's easy to see that. But for you to hold space at the same time, to remain that curious student, playful, kind of kid curiosity, like childlike tendency to that.
yeah.
I think that that is so cool to me, and I think that that's why that last sentiment you shared about walking with the people that you work with and the journey of it, I think that's where that really made sense to me. Of knowing you personally, I hope people who are listening
Yeah.
get a visual as well. But I think for me personally, that really connects a lot of dots, uh, just from all the conversations we've had. So yeah, man,
Yeah.
I appreciate your time. I appreciate you hopping on. And also like how what do people what do you have what do people how do people find you? What's going on with that scenario?
Yeah. I mean, I'm on Instagram quite a bit. I think, that's where every once in a while I'll send you like a meme or
Yeah,
something
yeah.
or a
Oh
quote.
yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah, yeah.
But Johan Speaks on Instagram, and I actually just kicked off a coaching firm called Development. So if you want to look up development.studio, you can see a coaching firm that I created with other like-minded folks who really
Sweet.
want to make an impact in this world and help people be their best. Um, so yeah, that's a little bit of where you can find me. And just like you, whenever I'm out in the world is, to live for expression and creativity and storytelling.
Yeah.
And the more I can connect with like-minded brothers like you, I think, the more I step into my power, as
Likewise.
well as we can make a bigger impact together. And that's what I loved, the conversations that we've had,
Hmm.
because I just feel a ton of alignment with you, right? Is like we
Likewise.
just know we're better together.
Yeah.
So we don't have to do it alone, right?
No
So
doubt.
thank you for having me on, and and just the conversation. It was so, so rich, man, and I feel like we're just scratching the surface.
No doubt, man. All right, brother. I appreciate you. Cheers. Appreciate you guys tuning into this one as well.